Okay, for this class, we're going to go over Aristotle's Politics. Of course, it's another important work in political theory, often talked about in conjunction, obviously, with Plato's Republic. Before we get into that, though, I thought I would, if I can switch over here, like to address something else, a little more of a current issue. Every now and then, I'll address somewhat topical issues in the class. And one thing I felt like I had to comment on is this latest, manufactured controversy over the Chinese balloon that was recently shot down. Let me just let some more people in here. This is from a website known as the World Socialist website. And I think their take on this is, a little bit different, to say the least, than a lot of the other things that we've been hearing. So over the past 4 days, the American population has been subjected to a barrage of war propaganda over the claim that China sent a huge balloon visible to the naked eye to spy on U.S. nuclear bases. The media machine is operating at full throttle. Since the balloon's existence was publicly announced last week, breathless coverage provided minute-by-minute updates on the progress of the floating white balloon as it slowly traversed across the continental United States. The story led every newspaper for days, was the first item on the evening news broadcast, and dominated the 24-hour cable news networks. Sorry, let me just let some more people in. Now, again, I think that already sort of sets the stage for everything that follows. This is completely, what is significant about this story is not the balloon itself, which is, I think, pretty clearly a weather balloon, but the media reaction to this and just how, quickly they go into overdrive, basically trying to sort of, concoct this, threat of China, basically. Something which is not exactly, new when we, look at previous, international conflicts that the U.S. has been involved in. On Friday, former President Donald Trump called for the balloon to be shot down, a demand that was repeated by Republican and Democratic politicians. On Saturday, under orders from Biden, the U.S. Air Force shot down the balloon in the first U.S. attack on a Chinese aircraft since the Korean War. A day after the balloon was announced, Secretary of State Blinken canceled his scheduled trip to China. All of the media coverage has accepted the unsubstantiated claims that the airship was a secret Chinese surveillance balloon specifically targeting U.S. military installations. While the specific purpose cannot be definitively stated, the notion that the Chinese government is seeking to secretly obtain vital information on U.S. nuclear weapons by means of a gigantic and clearly visible object slowly passing through the U.S. airspace is, to put it mildly, ludicrous. And I think that's the thing. And part of the reason why I'm commenting on this is that I recently saw a announcement from Rutgers, basically, that is also sort of jumping in on this obviously manufactured outrage, manufactured controversy, whatever you want to call it. The most obvious question is doesn't ever seem to be asked, which is that if China was trying to do something like this, why would they try to spy on the U.S.? Why would they do it in such obvious plain sight when they could just do it the way the U.S. does, or other countries even, through satellites? That's how we keep track of other countries and things like that and what's going on there. Something which is not beyond the capabilities of China to do. So that very important question doesn't ever seem to get asked. Far more likely is the account given by Beijing that the high-altitude balloon was conducting meteorological surveillance. It was blown off course. NASA has launched dozens of balloons similar to the one. Balloons offer flight opportunities for unique science investigations. Basically, they're saying this is a pretty common occurrence where these weather balloons get blown off course. Interesting here. In publications that are written primarily for those within the state apparatus, a more sober assessment can be found. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a leading think tank connected to U.S. intelligence agencies, commented on Friday that the most likely explanation is that this is an errant weather balloon that went astray, lost weather balloons are the basis of many UFO sightings. The CSIS added that the incident is embarrassing for China, and some Chinese meteorologists may be packing his or her bags for reassignment to Inner Mongolia. So it's interesting that in sort of, communication networks that are sort of more, elite level or sort of, outside of, the public view for the most part, there's a completely different narrative going forward, which is that, yeah, obviously this is, or at least most likely this is a Chinese weather balloon. This is not a big deal, in other words. But the narrative sort of, crafted for public consumption is, again, just sort of ratcheting up the intensity basically as much as they can. And again, as somebody who was, basically a college student during the, during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, I mean, this is something that I really take seriously. The ability of the media to sort of, again, really ratchet up the intensity of war propaganda in this country is a very disturbing thing to go through. And I would argue that this is probably a part of that as well. This is sort of seeding, the ground, sort of, gradually conditioning the public for basically a future war with China, which many top U.S. military officials would say is, only a couple of years away. But in the media, such an appraisal is nowhere to be found. That the white orb is a spy balloon is taken as fact. No section of the U.S. media has even suggested the possibility of the most routine and reasonable explanation. This was a peaceful research mission, just like NASA has conducted dozens of times. Seized on the opportunity to whip up anti-Chinese hate and xenophobia. The aim of this campaign is to condition the public to accept U.S. plans for war with China that have been years in the making, and to construe China, which the United States is encircling with offensive missiles just miles from its coastline, as the aggressor in the Sino-American conflict. The script of this week's imminent threat is well worn. This type of wall-to-wall media hysteria was used to justify the 1991 Gulf War, the 1998 bombing of Yugoslavia, the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the 2011 bombings of Syria and Libya. All of these claims, above all the Bush administration's assertions that the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, turned out to be nothing more than hot air. So again, I think that's a very important, historical context that you need to have in order to, understand basically what's going on now. But the media acting as if the American people are all idiots is reprising its role, hoping that it will have the same time-tested result of laying the groundwork for America's next war of choice. This time, the target is not an impoverished former colony, but China, the world's second largest economy with the world's second largest military budget. Although China's military budget is still like nowhere near what the U.S. spends on its military. I think China's military budget is something like 25% of what the United States spends. So even as this is going on with Russia, they're preparing for conflict with China. In 2018, the United States adopted national security strategy that urged the Pentagon to make its highest priority preparing for a war with China. While the military was operating with this conception, the U.S. media kept these plans secret from the American population. Again, thus showing that the media in this country is basically just propaganda. I mean, especially when it comes to war and foreign policy and things like that, that really it is no different than the kind of propaganda that you would see in a totalitarian regime. But this week's media hysteria over the balloon was used to introduce the concept of a potential war with China as a positive good for which the United States need to prepare. So on and so forth. Okay, I mean, I think that is enough. I don't think I need to go through it more than that. But again, as I was reading this article yesterday, I get an email from Rutgers. Does anyone get these Rutgers Today things, or Rutgers This Week, or whatever it's called? I get these things in my inbox, at least once or twice a week. And sure enough, it contained a link to this article, which is basically doing the exact same thing that, the other article I just read is criticizing, which is completely sort of, throwing fuel on the fire and completely sort of, validating this obviously, exaggerated, narrative that China is spying on us. So this is it's called More Than Hot Air. Political scientist says China's spy balloon is part of multifaceted national security risk. So again, just as the other article pointed out, the idea that it is a spy balloon is taken as a fact throughout the entire article. There's never any discussion whether or not this thing was actually a spy balloon or not. And then they start with this corny intro. Look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's a Chinese spy balloon. So once again, no question that this is actually a spy balloon, and a very corny way to start off an article, by the way. National security analysts took notice, warning that China is most likely using the balloon to collect sensitive information in U.S. communication systems and radars, and doing it in complete plain sight, not even trying to cover up what they're doing. Usually, if you're spying, you're usually trying to conceal your presence so that who you're spying on doesn't, is not alerted to what you're doing. But China apparently just sends a balloon up that even people standing around outside their houses can see quite clearly. The balloon was shot down off the coast of South Carolina 3 days after it was spotted, but experts say the event wasn't just a lot of hot air. It was, of course. The balloon's message was clear. China is here and China is watching. Again, in plain sight. The U.S. government has been well aware of Chinese spy activity for 2 decades, said Rutgers University Camden political scientist Woj Wolf, an expert in multiple international security areas. The real question that keeps U.S. counterintelligence operatives up at night is, what are they watching? So I'm not going to go through this whole thing. Again, I don't know if anyone else even saw this. I'm assuming everyone gets these Rutgers emails sent to them. It's just complete crap, quite frankly. And, it's embarrassing, really, that, like Rutgers would sort of, join in on the war propaganda, which is, what this essentially is, and publish such an embarrassing article like this. Anyway, I just felt somewhat compelled to comment on this. I was kind of on the fence about it, but then when I actually saw that there was this press release or whatever you want to call it from Rutgers itself, I felt kind of compelled to speak up on this. And again, we've seen this play out, in a historical sense, or if you're old enough to remember the Iraq War, to see this actually play out, this kind of drumming the war, beating or banging the war drum, so to speak, is a very, scary thing when you see the media sort of, kick into high gear over this. And this is just, a prelude basically of more, serious things, which will obviously be coming in the future. But again, the fact that they would take such a ridiculous example like this and sort of elevate it into a multifaceted national security risk, as it says here, I think is very, absurd, but also very alarming at the same time. And again, I would say the significance of the story is not the weather balloon itself, of course, which is a non-issue, but the fact that the media response to this has been so hysterical, basically, over this. Anyway, so that's my little prelude. Let me now switch over to the PowerPoint itself. Talk a little bit more about Aristotle. And again, let me also bring up some notes from last class as well. So, as I mentioned, Hegel, the German philosopher of the 19th century, believed that Plato's ideas, the way in which he connects these ideas together, often referred to as a dialectic, is kind of arbitrary, and I think there's something to that. For example, the way in which Plato connects the 3 parts of the soul, reason, spirit, and appetite, to 3 different classes within the city. To him, these structures parallel each other in a very odd way. Why would you assume that would necessarily be the case? So the way in which he connects these ideas together do in fact seem very arbitrary. He also says again that you could categorize different types of souls according to the different types of political regimes as well: aristocratic, timocratic, oligarchic, democratic, tyrannical. So that these structures, the structures of the soul and the structures of politics of the city, have this kind of dual or kind of parallel structure to each other. And Plato argues that these are, connected. And I think that the connections between the two seem to be sort of forced basically by Plato. On the other hand, what Plato is saying here, which is interesting, which Aristotle says as well, is that these, it does show you, I guess, how people are often shaped by the kind of environment that they live in, that the kind of political society that you live in, or the kind of society that you live in, will basically shape, who you are basically as a person, which I think is important. Now, the Orestia, in contrast, I think does have kind of a more logical transition from one to the other, from monarchy to tyranny to democracy. The flaws or the contradictions of monarchy necessarily lead to a tyranny. The as I've already said, the entanglement of of the private issues of the monarch and the public issues of the state become entwined in a way which you cannot easily separate them from. And of course, monarchies are prone to corruption. Even if you have a quote unquote good king, there's nothing to say that the next person to occupy the throne will be good as well. And of course, that's what happens in the Orestia. Of course, in this case, Agamemnon is murdered by his wife. Again, the entanglement of public and private issues paving the way for a tyranny. And that the transition from a tyranny to a democracy sort of comes from the realization that this kind of political order is unstable and not to the common benefit of people, that you probably don't want to have just one person wielding all of this power. That's much better, of course, to separate power and to have more people having a greater share in the politics of the society, and that you should have that the personal issues of the rulers should not be intertwined with public issues of justice and law and things like that. So Hegel's issue with Plato is that again, going back to this idea that Plato's ideas are arbitrary, Hegel would argue that the sort of opposing forces that you see, like monarchy and tyranny, for example, only appear to be opposite, right? In reality, they are connected to each other, and there's sort of a logical development from one to the other, then sort of like leading to the third step in this process. And that's basically Hegel's major issue with Plato here, is that Plato gives the impression that these development of these ideas, like for example the concept of justice, it just sort of happens in its own sort of arbitrary way. You just have a bunch of random people, and they may or may not talk about this, and may or may not make progress on this issue. For Hegel, the idea of the development of ideas of justice becoming more rational over time is a necessary process, and one which is sort of embedded within the concept of justice itself, that you don't need to have a conversation among people, that this sort of evolving nature of the concept can sort of happen by itself, both on on an individual level. You could imagine a person sort of working out these ideas for themselves, but also in a historical sense as well, which is very important to Hegel. The idea that again that society is gradually becoming more rational over time. Anyway, Hegel is a notoriously difficult philosopher to read, but many people would suggest that Aristotle actually is a key to unlocking Hegel, that a lot of Hegel's ideas are actually sort of taken from Aristotle, who was also somewhat critical of Plato as well, as I'll try to address here. Another idea, and this is sort of coming from previous classes as well, as I've mentioned a few times, this idea of socialism, the sort of transition to socialism and the different stages of socialism. Another thing which I'm not sure if I pointed out enough is that many people would now argue that a transition to socialism, to a lower stage and then to a higher stage of socialism, is kind of an obsolete idea. That the productive development of society has proceeded to such an extent that you don't need to go through a lower stage of socialism where you ration consumption to a higher stage. You could just simply make the transition to socialism. And I did in previous classes, point out things like how much, scarcity is sort of like artificially imposed upon people, that the amount of food that gets wasted in the United States, there's certainly more than enough to basically feed everybody, not just in the United States, but you could probably feed everybody in the world. That doesn't need there's no reason for anybody really to go hungry anymore. And of course, taking into account the ability to produce food throughout the world. That factories and things like that operate at much less than full capacity and things like that. I mean again, I've already shown some examples of that, but that would be one argument for that. Yeah, Jerome.
Could you please repeat what was Hegel's critique of Plato?
Hegel thinks that Plato is arbitrary, that the way in which he sort of connects ideas together, or the way in which he develops ideas through the course of the Republic and in his other writings as well, his other dialogues as well, that there's this kind of arbitrary nature to them. So, for example, the discussion of justice in Plato takes the appearance of a debate between people, and these people are coming up with different ideas, and Socrates is contradicting them, and then other people weigh in on the debate, like Glaucon and Adeimantus. For Hegel, that's not a necessary thing. Hegel objects to the idea that the discussion of justice seems to be just an arbitrary debate among people, which could go in a bunch of different ways. For Hegel, the idea of justice has a distinct sort of logical structure to it, which goes through basically its own process of development. So for Hegel, ideas sort of develop through their own inner logic, which is basically what he calls the dialectic, going through these different phases of development, basically. And that there's no need for a bunch of people to sit around talking about these things, that these ideas sort of develop themselves, essentially, and that there's a strong sort of historical aspect to it as well, that throughout history the idea of justice is developing and basically becoming more and more rational. And the way in which it develops is basically going through these different phases where you have sort of a concept of justice. That concept, sort of runs into its own contradictions, basically. And then that leads to a sort of higher articulation of the idea of justice. And then the process can repeat itself as well, but it usually goes through this sort of three-part structure. Let me show an example from Hegel. So, and I know we mentioned last class that just move some of the stuff around here, that Hegel doesn't necessarily follow this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or at least he doesn't specifically use those terms, even though it is commonly attributed to him. And I would say actually that's kind of an indicator. If somebody says that Hegel uses that kind of lets you know that they may not know exactly what they're talking about. So he doesn't use thesis, antithesis, and synthesis explicitly. However, if you look through his work, you see that this kind of triadic structure certainly plays a big role in the development of his thinking. So this is the table of contents from his famous book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And I kind of jumped right to here because this is not actually the first page within the book. You have to kind of skip through the author's introduction to get to it. Again, you sort of see the triadic structure play out, A, B, C, and then you sort of see like triads within triads, basically, consciousness to self-consciousness to reason. And then you see, the double A here, the double B, spirit, religion. And then only at the very end do you get sort of to, you sort of break out of that triadic structure. But again, like I said, and you see sort of triads within triads, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, so on and so forth. Obviously, I'm not going to go through this. This is a very, complex work, but it does, I think, illustrate, again, the importance of this sort of triadic thinking within Hegel's philosophy. And again, for him, it is this sort of, inner development So you start at sort of like the lowest level of consciousness, and then through this process of sort of working out its own limitations or contradictions, you sort of get to higher and higher levels of consciousness to self-consciousness to reason, and then so on and so forth. And again, it's a very complicated work. I just wanted to sort of illustrate how important this sort of triadic structure is to Hegel's thinking. And then like I said, it gets very elaborate. We have triads within triads and things like that. But he does pretty much consistently follow that all the way through. Hegel also, besides being an interesting thinker in his own right, you can go online and find his commentaries on different philosophers. Hegel was, in his day known for having basically like an encyclopedic knowledge, basically, of pretty much every philosopher up to him, obviously. And so it's he's written a lot on the ancient Greek thinkers and other thinkers after them, and it is kind of interesting. And some may be a little more accessible than his own writings, where he's developing his own ideas. But you can sort of read his commentaries on these other philosophers as well. And he does, of course, hold Plato up in very high regard. I'm not saying that he doesn't. It's just that ultimately he does see some problems with Plato's philosophy. And again, I would say a lot of the things that he objects to Plato, you'll also basically find within Aristotle as well. That's why I think that maybe Aristotle may be a key, in a sense, to unlocking Hegel, since Hegel is a notoriously difficult philosopher to read. Marx, by the way, also held Aristotle up in very high regard and considered him basically the most important thinker, or the greatest thinker of antiquity. Anyway, so I think I ran through that for the most part. Let's get into Aristotle himself. So this is a famous painting by the Renaissance painter Raphael, known as the School of Athens. Basically, what it is a fictional scenario of all the great philosophers throughout history, and you can see that the focal point in the center of the image is Plato and Aristotle. I've sort of blown this up a little bit. So I'm reading in the comments. This is Mario, I think, right? Is rationality ideally coming from the instruction of the institution like the church use in order to use religion in order to govern others? Hegel reminds me personally of Ralph Waldo Emerson, especially when it comes to a certain degree of self-consciousness and self-realization. Yeah, I mean, Hegel's ideas were definitely probably most in vogue in the 19th century. I think there is some indication that Emerson and other people may have been influenced by Hegel, especially during that period of time, early to mid 19th century, I think was when Hegel's ideas were probably most influential. The idea that rationality is coming from institutions like the church. Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned last class, right, that Nietzsche kind of sees Christianity as sort of like, like a dumbed down version of Greek philosophy, or at least he says something like that. And I think, yeah, there is definitely a lot of carryover from the ancient Greek philosophers to Christianity, within Islam, Judaism as well. And as I've said, some people would argue, I don't know how confirmed it is, but that, some people even think that, Plato may have been influenced by Hindu philosophy and things like that. So there might be some overlap there as well. But yeah, I mean, it is the idea that these institutions are supposed to be rational, that they're supposed to, again, sort of contribute to the justice of society as a whole. Now, religion in the sense of the ancient Greeks was much, different than I guess we would understand it now. But religion of a sort, of course, did obviously play a very big role in their society as well, right? The importance of religious observance and things like that. So yeah, I would argue that yes, religion is, again, ideally speaking, supposed to play a role in sort of, creating a more rational society. That's why it's important now to have a separation between church and state. Yeah, I mean, and I'm not sure that's something that they would have followed, but obviously there are a lot of aspects of Plato and Aristotle's thinking and other ancient thinkers as well, of course, that would not, fit in well to our modern day conception of things. And again, Nietzsche has talked about that as well. I mean, for one, the Greeks were much more, warlike than we were or are, for the most part, at least. It's often been argued that the Greeks did not have a concept of individual rights and liberty that is as developed as we have in modern day society. That the Greeks were much more inclined to sort of accept the interest of the collective or the interests of the society at large as basically taking precedence over the individual person. And of course, an extension of that, I think that does relate to the idea of the separation of church and state, because again, religion is now basically taken to be sort of an individual matter, right? A question of individual faith and things like that. Although, American society hasn't always exactly followed that idea as well. And I would say up until fairly recently, I mean, they were pretty, explicit about, Christian values and things like that. In my other class on American politics, which I don't teach here, but I teach at another school, I'll actually be talking about that soon. To what extent do, Christian values play an important role in the founding of the United States? And I would argue that they do play a very big role. And you could argue to what extent they, still, I mean, I would say they're very deeply a part of American institutions now. So even if you're not, consciously following them or consciously even aware of them as so-called Christian values, that I think that they still do definitely play a role, as does the concern with justice, which is obviously something that comes out of Plato and Aristotle. But obviously, you can find any number of examples of justice being, talked about in scriptures, whether the Old Testament, the New Testament, and various other examples as well. Anyway, so this is sort of the again, like I said, the focal point of the image. Plato is gesturing towards the sky. Aristotle sort of, putting his hand, over the ground. And that's sort of, Raphael's way of sort of illustrating the differences between the two. Plato gesturing to the sky is basically an indication of Plato's doctrine of the forms, or theory of the forms, as it's often known. A very confusing idea. This idea that there are sort of perfect forms of everything that exists, but that sort of exist outside of our reality. Which again, if you're sort of interpreting Plato in a Christian view, it's tempting to think of that as like heaven or something like that, although I don't think that's exactly what Plato had in mind. But Aristotle is a much more sort of empirical minded thinker, and Aristotle, of course, did reject Plato's idea of the forms or theory of the forms. And in fact, Aristotle would argue that what Plato calls forms, these sort of universal concepts like beauty and goodness and things like that, don't exist in some sort of higher realm, but they exist within the world. It's just certain concepts that we have that are shared by more than one thing, right? There's more than one beautiful object in the world, or there's more than one thing that we could say is beautiful that exists in the world. That doesn't mean that beauty exists in some sort of higher realm. It just means that it's a concept basically that we attach to multiple things that have something in common, which that thing in common being they are considered beautiful. And of course, there's a whole thing about beauty is in the eye of the beholder, stuff like that. But that's another topic. Anyway, so Aristotle is much more of an empirically grounded thinker, much more based in observation, less speculative, I think you could say in many ways, than Plato was. And I think that serves as an interesting sort of contrast between the two. And again, I would argue that this, you could make a good argument here that Aristotle is possibly the first true political scientist. Plato is a political philosopher, but Aristotle is the first one to really undergo an fairly extensive, at least for the standards of the time, sort of empirical observation and cataloging of the actual different, sort of political states that he saw, which of course then were city states, and sort of, observe these states, or read up on them as much as he could, and try to sort of, based on this kind of, empirical observation, try to derive, general ideas or theories that are common to politics, or what are sort of common characteristics that you see within the state. And I think that's important, but it's sort of based upon empirical observation. So anyway, so the Greek term politikos means basically of or pertaining to the polis. The polis is basically the city state, or basically what we would call the political community. Today, of course, we don't think of politics in terms of city states, but usually in terms of nation states. So Aristotle, again, thought of what he was doing as a politicae episteme, or political science, basically, political knowledge. As I said, Aristotle is arguably the first political scientist. The politics, or politica, is possibly a series of distinct essays that were, sort of assembled together later on. And that's an interesting thing to think of, that the politics, even though we think of it as a unified work, was probably in all likelihood maybe written at different points in time, and then sort of combined together later on. In fact, it's even a debatable thing to what extent we even have an original text from Aristotle. Many people think that what passes for the politics, his work, is basically just something made up of his own notes, maybe even lecture notes from his own students, which is interesting to think of. I mean, how reliable could they even be? Maybe, I mean, not to say that they wouldn't be completely unreliable either. Aristotle, much like many other ancient thinkers, a lot of his works are lost as well. It's estimated somewhere around maybe 3/4 or 75% of his writings have been lost, and what remains are again fragments, or again like basically notes that he may have taken, sort of like outlines basically that he may have written rather than the actual original text themselves. Not all that different from Aeschylus, who, like I mentioned, out of 70 plays that he wrote, only 7 remain. So basically 90% of his works have basically been lost. So Aristotle sees, political science basically as sort of dealing with his sort of larger breakdown of knowledge and science. And for Aristotle, there are basically 3 main categories. And it's tough to say where exactly political science fits into that. On the one hand, he talks about the contemplative sciences, including physics and metaphysics, which is concerned with truth or knowledge for its own sake, which he calls episteme. Now, it would seem that politics falls outside of that, but yet he also refers to political knowledge as, like I said, an episteme, politikos episteme. Most people consider his political science to be a kind of practical science, or phronesis, a science concerned with good action. How do you sort of get people to act in a good way? But there are also aspects of it that correspond with the third branch of knowledge, or the third branch of science, he says, the so-called productive sciences, or technical, basically, which is a branch of knowledge which is concerned with making useful or beautiful objects, like craftsmanship, or again, technical skill, basically, to manufacture something or produce something. Anyway, politics is a practical science, since it is concerned with the noble action or happiness of the citizens as a whole, although it does in some ways resemble a productive science in that it seeks to create, preserve, and reform political systems. So the political system itself becomes kind of an object that is created or produced by the political leaders. Or, like I also said, it also kind of shows at least some aspects of being an episteme as well. And Aristotle is known for being a very sort of systematic thinker in this regard, and that he sort of, is very analytical and tends to break things down in different categories like this. Anyway, so his notion of political science is not exactly like how we think of political science in the present day, and that is not purely descriptive or empirical. It is concerned with basically making people better, which is a debatable thing. I'm not sure everybody would agree with that notion that modern day political science is supposed to be making people better. Instead, it's much more supposedly supposed to be a kind of a value neutral or impartial way of explaining things. I have some issue with the idea of value neutrality in the social sciences. I don't think anything is really totally value neutral or impartial. I think there are always some kind of values that are at least implicit there. But anyway, that's one way in which Aristotle is supposedly different from modern day political science. Yeah, Jerome.
So I was wondering, since political science is a practical science, could we say in scholastic terms that there is a connection between politics and the practical mind, and that Aristotle, just like Plato, connects ethics, like his books, he has a book about ethics and politics, and there's a continuity between both?
Yeah. Usually, yes, when you talk about Aristotle's political philosophy, you usually cover both his ethics and his politics. We don't really have time for that. I mean, there are other, people that I want to talk about in the class going forward. I guess I could have devoted 1 week to Aristotle's ethics and 1 week to his politics. But yes, usually his ethics and politics are usually both talked about in relation to his political theory. And again, yes, are both aspects of what he calls phronesis, or basically a branch of knowledge which is supposed to, again, basically make people better, or sort of lead people to make good actions, or to take good actions, to act in a good way, in other words. And I'll definitely make reference to his ethics at some points. I mean, particularly in his discussion of justice, where the connections are probably most explicit. But yes, I mean, for Aristotle, political knowledge was basically just another version, essentially, of ethical knowledge. Just like in Plato's Republic, we see a discussion of justice as an ethics, and then also a discussion of justice in the political order itself. So this sort of moving back and forth between talking about individual ethics and politics are very much inseparable topics, basically, for the ancient Greek thinkers. And again, is one way in which I would say modern political science has diverged from. I mean, we don't normally think of political science as a branch of ethics anymore. Although, of course, in political philosophy and things like that, there are still often debates about ethics. But they are usually even then separated from sort of the other branches of political science, like comparative politics and international relations and things like that. Anyway, like Plato, I didn't assign the entire text to read, only a portion of it. I'll try as much as I can to sort of give a sort of full outline of the text. But this is sort of basically a breakdown of the different books that make up the politics and what they talk about. So book 1, Aristotle really lays out his argument for the naturalness of the city-state and of the household. To him, politics is a natural function of human beings, that it is natural for us to enter into political communities, to coexist, to cooperate, and work together. These are to him natural, qualities of the human species. And Aristotle does tend to study human beings as if they are just another version of, or just another type of animal species, basically. And Aristotle did do a lot of other work in zoology and things like that as well. Aristotle is a very comprehensive thinker, and we're only looking at a very small, portion of his thinking, but arguably his most important part, and probably what is most relevant today. So yes, he argues that the city-state is natural, that again, politics is natural to human beings just as much as living in a household, a family structure. He critiques in book 2, which is not covered here, or not covered in the readings, but he sort of runs through again what are generally considered to be good political societies in his day, like Carthage and Sparta, maybe a few other examples. And again, this is sort of in line with his idea of sort of engaging in a kind of empirical analysis, that he's actually sort of observing, not hypothetical or ideal political communities the way that Plato does, for example, but looking at actually existing political communities and critiquing them, finding out what's wrong with them, basically. And this will sort of then feed into his larger discussion within books 4 through 6. Book 3, which is arguably the most important part of the politics, is his so-called general theory of constitutions, and this is probably the most important part of his text. Aristotle's idea of constitutions are different, basically, than what we would think of as a written document, basically, that sort of lays out the way in which the government is going to be structured, although that does play into his idea as well. But for Aristotle, the constitution of a city-state is basically like the soul of the city-state. It sort of is the defining characteristic of what makes it what it is. And then books 4 through 6, like I said, he basically, again, sort of runs through, again, the different types of political regimes that exist, critiques them in ways, tries to understand, what makes them durable, what preserves them, what leads to their destruction, basically. Aristotle's trying to prevent political conflict, try to give insight into how you can sort of head off political conflict and civil war and things like that. And that basically goes through books 4 through 6. Books 7 and 8, the last 2 books, basically is an unfinished outline of what he considers to be the best constitution. So again, it's an interesting thing. Aristotle is, on the one hand, very empirical and very sort of grounded in observation of actual political societies that existed during his day. But he also does engage in this more sort of utopian kind of speculative thinking as well, which you saw basically more so in Plato's Republic. Now, again, there is debate over to what extent these books, which are subdivided into chapters, but the way in which these books sort of follow each other. Some would argue that books 7 and 8 may have been written earlier, and that book 7 and 8 should follow book 3, for example, and the books 4 through 6 were written at a later point. It's confusing because there are overlapping references to the text. So, for example, in book 3, Aristotle refers to things that he would talk about in books 4 through 6 and in books 7 through 8, particularly talking about the best type of government and things like that. So, we don't have to get that concerned about it, but there is some debate, basically, like I said, over what order these books should be read in, what time period these things were written in. But we're going to take it for granted that this is the traditional format of the text. This is pretty much what we'll be following. So again, like I already said, Aristotle's political theory is often studied in conjunction with his ethical theories, laid out in 2 main works, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. Of the 2, the Nicomachean Ethics is the more well-known, influential work. And sort of the basic principles of Aristotle's ethics, which do play a role in his politics, is that happiness is the highest human good. So Aristotle places great emphasis on happiness, on human happiness, people living happy lives, something which he feels that Plato tends to neglect in his writings. That happiness is the activity of moral virtue defined in terms of the mean. So the Aristotelian idea of the mean is sort of like a moderate course between 2 extremes. So, for example, when we think of in terms of, how we regulate our desires and appetites and things like that, there's sort of gluttony on the one extreme, but then there's sort of this extreme abstinence on the other hand. And for Aristotle, the sort of, the ethical course of action was to sort of, strive for sort of a mean, basically, or sort of like a middle ground between these 2 extremes. It's an interesting idea. you can apply it obviously to very, other different examples. Courage would be another one. You don't want to, shrink away from challenge or conflict, or, run with your tail between your legs, but you don't want to be, reckless and, getting into, fights with basically every person that you run into. So again, courage for him is sort of, again, sort of a moderate course of action between two extremes. And those sort of ethical principles play a big role in his politics as well. As we'll see, when he talks about a good political order, he tends to sort of reference this idea of sort of a moderate course of action. He even talks a lot about the importance of a middle class as a way of sort of, regulating conflict within society, that you shouldn't have extremes of wealth and poverty, for example, something which I think is very relevant now, and which I'll say something about later on. And anyway, basically the third principle, again, is that justice is the common advantage, or justice or the common advantage is the highest political good. So again, a good political order is one that promotes justice basically within society. And justice to him is the common advantage, that everyone is sort of doing well, everyone is sort of benefiting basically from the way things are. Yeah, Jerome.
So if I am not mistaken, the term mean refers to this constant research of a balance between two things, right?
Two extremes, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So means, Professor. So means is on like on a spectrum then, on one end of like, yeah. So like, so I guess what Jerome was saying, that means is in like it could go on two ends of the spectrum, where it can go to like the extreme form of it, where it's similar to like what we see as the far right and the far left, like in a modern day sense.
Yeah, sure. You can make that argument. I mean, he, when he's talking about it in his ethics, he's usually talking about different sort of, virtues and vices and different sort of, moral qualities. Like I said, courage versus being a coward, being a glutton versus being totally abstinent. He doesn't necessarily, to him, either one of those things are extreme. So what an ethical person does is try to, like I said, try to find sort of like a middle ground, or sort of a more moderate course of action between these two extremes.
So it's like being disciplined versus being undisciplined.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But not to the point where you, again, completely deny yourself.
It's on that spectrum. Yeah, it's on that spectrum, I guess. Like the means is within the spectrum of discipline and of not discipline. And just like one would hope that they're somehow in a way where they can allow their own virtue. At least for me, that's what I guess my interpretation of it is, that they allow themselves to be in the middle, where they recognize their own vices or their senses of where they're undisciplined, and then they go from there. Like it's like it's on a spectrum where you can go back and forth and change by the day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, an interesting idea. I wonder if it, does that always, can you apply that to every circumstance? But I mean, as sort of a, a guide to action, which I guess is what ethics is supposed to be. I mean, it's not, it's a pretty good idea, I guess. I mean, to sort of, not be, too extreme in one way or the other. And like I already said, that these kind of ethical ideas are not, commonly shared in contemporary political science. So what is the purpose of political science? So for Aristotle, it is basically to aid the statesman or the political leader, basically, much in the same way that medical science basically assists the physician. And Aristotle actually makes this, comparison explicitly. So political knowledge or political science is basically supposed to aid political leaders in making good political choices, making good laws, governing in a good way, much the same way in which a doctor basically will use, current developments within medical science basically to care for their patients. In other words, that they are, the political leader should, fashion an appropriate constitution for the city-state, which again takes into account circumstances, local circumstances that the community finds itself in, which this would include the different laws, the customs, the institutions of the political state, including moral education. So a great emphasis is also much like in Plato, a great emphasis is sort of laid on the education of people. Now, Aristotle's ideas of education, I think, are a little more inclusive, though, in that he seems to think that most people can be educated, at least up to a certain point, to be a virtuous person, as he would say, up to a certain point. Whereas for Plato, Plato's ideas of education and what it takes to be basically a rational person were so rigorous that it basically excluded most people. And so his political theories kind of flow from that, right? Because his views, what it would take to actually be a just person is such a high standard that he concludes that only a very, select group of people would, ever be able to actually, conduct themselves or sort of, govern in a just way. Aristotle seems a little more, inclusive when it comes to that. He also compares, this is Aristotle, compares the political leader, again, to a craftsman. That the political leader is somebody who's sort of like making something, or sort of manufacturing a good state, basically, a good political community, just as you would expect, a potter to make, pots, or, whatever it is, a carpenter to make a cabinet, or so on and so forth. There's a sort of technical aspect to it as well, and this sort of craftsman-like aspect to it. So an important part of Aristotle's thinking is what he refers to as the four causes, and this is something which he employs in a lot of different ways, but he employs it in talking about politics as well. So Aristotle explains the production of an artifact such as a drinking cup in terms of four causes: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. So, for example, when you're making a drinking cup, clay would be the material cause. Clay is the actual raw material that you're using to fashion this cup. This clay is then molded into a roughly cylindrical shape, closed at one end, which is the formal cause, or the form or the shape or structure that a thing takes. The potter, the person actually molding the clay, takes the role of the efficient cause, the one that's actually sort of exerting force basically upon this material and sort of again fashioning it into a certain shape. And that the final cause is basically the purpose that the cup is, which is basically to contain a beverage. Now, again, like many aspects of Aristotle's thinking, this is not generally accepted in modern day scientific knowledge. For example, modern day science would pretty much only follow the idea of the efficient cause, the idea that there's some sort of force exerting itself upon something else to make it do something. All these other ideas, particularly the idea of a final cause, or that something has an intrinsic purpose to it, is sort of not considered a sort of outdated way of looking at things. But anyway, we start with a simple example like a drinking cup to sort of set up Aristotle's more in-depth discussion of talking about this in terms of, again, the polis, or the political community. So the material cause of the political community are the people themselves. It is a community, koinonia, or a community, basically, a collection of parts having some functions and interests in common. Hence, it is made up of parts, meaning that the community is made up of different people that do different things. And for him, the community is basically, again, sort of the raw material that the polis is later made out of. This community is made up of households, economic classes, local political units, but ultimately the city-state is composed of individual citizens as well. So citizens make up the basis of these different communities and households and classes and things like that, who, along with natural resources, are the material or equipment out of which the city-state is fashioned. So the people basically are the material cause of the city. The formal cause is the Constitution. So the formal cause of the city-state is its constitution. Aristotle defines the Constitution as a certain ordering of the inhabitants of the city-state. So again, much like the clay in the drinking cup is fashioned into a specific shape, the constitution of a city-state fashions the people into a certain shape. It takes the sort of raw material of people and sort of organizes them in a certain way, which takes on different characteristics. It can be a democratic city-state, it can be, you know, a tyrannical city-state, so on and so forth. And the people themselves are sort of, you know, who they are basically becomes, you know, reflected in that. He also speaks of the constitution of a community as the form of the compound, and argues that whether the community is the same over time depends on whether it has the same constitution. So as the constitution of a city-state changes, so do the people, basically. The Constitution is not a written document, or at least not necessarily so, but an immanent, meaning inside, organizing principle, analogous basically to the soul of an organism. So basically the Constitution is like the soul of the city. And this soul basically, again, is sort of reflected in the people as well. Hence, the Constitution is also the way of life of the citizens. Here, the citizens are that minority of the resident population who possess full political rights. So again, not everyone who lives within the city are going to be citizens. In fact, most will not. And I think, as I've already said, I think only maybe 10% or maybe 20% of, I think it's more like 10% of the people who actually lived within ancient Athens were actually citizens. The vast majority of them were either slaves, resident aliens, meaning people who were not slaves but were not, you know, citizens of the city, women who were, you know, given a kind of citizenship role but were not allowed to vote and play any political role and things like that. So citizens only make up a small portion of the city itself. Would Aristotle view the Constitution as a living, breathing document? Yes, I think he would. I think, you know, for example, the United Kingdom is an example of a state, a political state that has a constitution, but is not actually written down in the same way that the Constitution of the United States is. The British so-called Constitution is basically made up of a bunch of different documents over time, even going as far back to the Magna Carta of the 13th century. It is not sort of contained within a single document, much like the United States. But yes, I mean, the idea of, you know, equating the Constitution to the soul of the city-state, I would argue that the American Constitution does, in many ways, kind of, you know, set the character of the country and the sort of sets sort of basic core principles, basically, for how, obviously for how the American government works, but also basically sort of sets sort of values, basically, that the people themselves kind of, you know, aspire to or sort of embody in some way. So it's a tricky idea, but I mean, again, the idea of the Constitution is basically, like it says, it's sort of like the soul of the city, basically. All right, and again, it sort of gives shape and structure to the city as well. The efficient cause of the polis, or of the city, is the ruler, who's actually in charge, whether it's one person or a group of people. But the rulers of the city-state, or ruler, are the ones that basically, again, sort of exert force on the raw material, that is the people, that sort of fashion the shape or the constitution of the city, and sort of, you know, control how that constitution basically changes as well, or whether or not it stays the same. On Aristotle's view, a community of any sort can possess order only if it has a ruling element or authority. This ruling principle is defined by the Constitution, which sets the criteria for political offices, particularly the sovereign office, in other words, who's ruling. However, on a deeper level, there must be an efficient cause to explain why a city-state acquires its constitution in the first place. Aristotle states that the person who first established the city-state is the cause of very great benefits. This is basically the so-called lawgiver, the person who sort of establishes the political community in the first place. Someone like Solon of Athens or Lycurgus of Sparta, who founded the Constitution. So again, the American analog obviously would be the founding fathers, right? George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, and people like that. They would be the so-called lawgiver. Aristotle compares the lawgiver or the politician more generally to a craftsman, again, like a weaver or shipbuilder who fashions material into a finished product. And then you get to the final cause, or basically the purpose of the city-state. And actually, Aristotle basically lays this out in the very opening lines of the Politics, as he says, as we see that every city is a society, and every society is established for some good purpose. For an apparent good is the spring of all human actions. It is evident that this is the principle upon which they are everyone founded, and this is more especially true of that which has for its object the best possible, and is itself the most excellent, and comprehends all the rest. Now, this is called a city, and the society thereof a political society. So if that's not clear, what he's basically saying is that the purpose of the political society is for people to live what he calls the good life. Not just to live, not just to survive, but to be happy, basically. Later on in chapter 2, he says, hence it is evident that every city is a natural production and that man is naturally a political animal. So human happiness basically depends upon people entering into political life. Not necessarily that you're like in office, but that you are a part of a political community. He says that is, that it is, that it comes naturally to people. The people have a natural ability to cooperate, he says, which he argues as evidence for the so-called naturalness of political life. And that this, again, is necessary basically for human happiness, which you would assume, I think, that the most people aspire to, right? Most people want to live, I think, happy lives. Yeah, Jerome.
Do you say that Aristotle and Plato's conception of the city as a mean for the individual to achieve common personal happiness, would you say that it reflects a very individualistic conception of society?
Well, I mean, like I said, that's one of the things that people debate more about, these Greek thinkers, is that, to what extent do they really understand individual rights versus, the common good and things like that. Many people tend to assume that, yes, they tend to subordinate individual happiness to the common good. I think maybe you see that more so in Plato, maybe, than Aristotle. I think Aristotle, there definitely at least seem to be indications within his text that he seems to understand, individual happiness as an important thing, that people, again, aspire to live that way. The problem, again, with a lot of the ancient thinkers is that there's no real, even to this very day, no real definitive consensus on what they thought about anything. There are just multiple interpretations, owing, I think, largely to the fragmentary nature of many of these texts, the fact that they're translated and how you translate them, oftentimes, leads to different, meanings and things like that. My personal take on it would be, it seems that Aristotle has a stronger idea of individual rights than Plato does, or individual happiness maybe than Plato does. But you could also argue that both of them would certainly fall short to sort of a more modern conception of individual rights, where we generally hold that the individual, the right of the individual is sort of sacred, basically, and cannot be sacrificed necessarily for the common good. Whereas I think both Plato and Aristotle would be willing to probably say that, yeah, if there's some kind of conflict that, the sacrifice of one person is necessary for the greater good, they would probably be willing to make that sacrifice. But like I said, like anything else, it's open to different interpretations. Yeah, Mario?
So when you're talking about Aristotle and basically trying to get to his point of what is the end goal overall, not only just for the polis, but I think overall, I think he uses the polis in a way where he talks about his own individuality, where he himself is trying to find what is his purpose. And in using that, other writers could possibly just use the polis as a grand scheme of thing instead of them just projecting that this is my purpose or this is what I'm trying to find for myself. What is my purpose? That's how.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, yeah, again, for him, the purpose is to, again, basically allow people, as he says, to live the good life. Now, what does he mean by the good life? Again, it's another term which is open to multiple interpretations. What he seems to suggest is that the good life is more than just survival. It's more than just the getting by, subsistence level. It's living, a good life, living a life of, culture, I guess you would say. I mean, being able to sort of, get the most out of life, basically, to sort of live life to the highest, level, basically.
Finding their sole purpose.
Yeah, and yeah, and again, I mean, people would have different purposes. I mean, I'm sure everyone would probably, at least to some extent, define the idea of the good life in a different way. I'm sure, I mean, if you really had to go into detail, maybe at least about what you think the good life would be like. I mean, I'm sure most people would probably have different ideas of that. And I think Aristotle understands that. And again, to a large extent, the purpose of political life is to accommodate that, to allow people to sort of, live their lives and sort of, their own conception, basically, of what a good life would be like. But he does also realize that that is only really something that can be attained through cooperation, through basically people sort of working towards the common advantage, basically, of everyone else, to live in a just society, much like Plato. So again, so the good life is there. I'm sorry, were you gonna say something?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Oh, sure. So again, the city-state comes into being to preserve life, but continues to exist to enable people to live to live the good life. So he even seems to argue that, yes, originally people, form a community to, protect themselves against foreign threats, to pool their resources together, that there is definitely a survival aspect to the founding of political life. But the reason why they continue to exist is to allow people to sort of live at a higher level, basically, to basically get, like I said, to sort of get the most out of life that they could. So wait, did I want to say something about that? Okay, no, so it's actually in this slide here. So again, as I already mentioned, Aristotle rejected Plato's theory of forms. Aristotle's idea is often referred to as being hylomorphic, meaning he does not see forms as being something abstract or something that exists entirely separate from the material world, but that they are both sort of, combined within each other, basically, is probably the easiest way to put it. Hegel, I think, also seems to share that idea to a large extent. Plato's theory of forms being completely separate from the material world sort of breaks down this sort of unity that Hegel sees within things, the sort of what he calls a union of opposites, or the idea, again, that opposing forces like form and matter. The idea of apparent opposites, I think, is important. Emphasis on the word apparent. For Hegel, things that seem like they're opposites from each other only appear to be opposites. At a deeper level, they're actually not. They're necessary parts of each other. And many people, and I'll mention it too, but many people have maybe said that there's some similarity between that and something like the Taoist concept of the yin yang, right? These yin and yang, these opposing forces that are sort of, necessary components of one another. There does at least seem to be, some aspect within Hegel, within Hegel's idea as well. And I would argue, sort of, reading Hegel as an Aristotelian thinker, that idea is probably within Aristotle too. So form and matter are linked. Another interesting idea within Aristotle's idea, and again, something else that Hegel picks up on, is this idea of a formal final cause. so that the formal cause, the shape and structure of something, and the final cause, the purpose of that thing, are linked. Okay, so the problem with the final cause, in Greek often referred to as the telos or teleology, the idea that something has a kind of final end or purpose to it, is that many people would argue that when you say that something has a purpose, that again, it's an arbitrary thing. You're sort of projecting your own sort of meaning onto something else and saying, well, this is what this thing is meant to be used for, when really that's not clear. Okay, maybe that's true. The way in which Aristotle tries to deal with it, and the way in which, Hegel sort of picks up on that as well, is that the purpose of something is derived from the shape or structure of something. So the form of something basically tells you the purpose of something. Now, going back to the example, I'm laughing because I know this is, a confusing idea, but going back to the idea of, the coffee cup or whatever, or a clay cup. The purpose of the clay cup is to hold liquid. How do you know that's the purpose of the cup? By looking at the shape of the cup. So the shape or the form of the cup basically tells you what the purpose of that thing is. At least that's how they try to deal with that idea. Now, in a similar way, you could argue that the purpose of the political state, which is again, for Aristotle, supposed to be, to allow people to live a good life, you could argue derives from the shape of the community. And a community that is sort of, shaped well balanced and things like that will allow people to live a good life. And a political community that is distorted or misshapen in some way will sort of deviate from that purpose. It's a confusing idea, but that is, I think, more or less what they say. Anyway, this sort of leads now into more so into Aristotle's idea of different types of constitutions, which again are the form of the city-state. And again, I would argue this, which mostly happens within book 3 of his Politics, is maybe the most important part of the book overall. And certainly, I think what gets emphasized the most. So I'll spend some time on that. Again, for Aristotle, the Constitution is more like the soul of the polis rather than an actual written document. Citizens are different from slaves and resident aliens, as I already said. Women, children, and even seniors have restrictions on citizenship, as do most workers, the working class. For Aristotle, a citizen shares in the deliberative and judicial offices of the polis, meaning that they share in deliberation, debates basically, and also debates about, what laws are going to be passed and things like that. Judicial refers to things like, again, sitting on juries and things like that, and even being, judges over cases. So citizens play those roles. Non-citizens don't. Non-citizens play more of a passive role. Again, a constitution defines the governing body, who actually rules and who actually holds power within the city. Aristotle talks about the different types of rule, like master and slave, which he argues is not compatible at all with political life. This leads to a very, controversial part of Aristotle's writings on slavery. Is Aristotle defending slavery? He seems to argue that some people are meant to be slaves, essentially. But some have taken it to be, and again, different interpretations here. Some argue that Aristotle's defense of slavery, and by the way, the disenfranchisement of women, or the belief that women should not be citizens and have rights to vote and things like that, are so bad. They're so deliberately bad that it's meant to be sort of an ironic defense of those ideas. I'm not, again, different interpretations. I'm not necessarily sure that is the case. Aristotle's views on slavery and women within and the roles of women within society, if he did mean this in a sincere way, would not be distinct basically from how most Greek thinkers thought back then, and how most people thought for very long periods of time afterwards as well. So it wouldn't be unusual at all for Aristotle to think that, some people should be slaves and women should not have the right to vote. So that's possible. I mean, it's also possible that Aristotle could have thought differently, maybe had different views. Anyway, so a good constitution is basically a constitution which aims at the common advantage of people, particularly the citizens as a whole. And this sort of leads into his famous sort of typology, or different basically classifications of the different types of city-states. And again, so basically from this, he sort of derives six different types of political order. And as you can see, it's defined in terms of, whether power is in the hands of one ruler, a few rulers, or many rulers. And from that, he derives different types of what he calls correct or deviant types of politics. And the correct types of politics, the ones that are, again, shaped well, have a well-balanced shape to them or form, are the ones that aim toward the common advantage of everybody. So kingship, aristocracy, and polity. The deviant forms, the misshapen forms, are the ones which aim only to the advantage of the rulers: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Now, again, as you can see, these are sort of like mirror opposites of each other. The mirror opposite of a monarchy or kingship is a tyranny. The opposite of an aristocracy is an oligarchy. And most interesting of all, perhaps, is the idea of the mirror opposite of a polity is a democracy. So for Aristotle, democracy was a bad type of government. It was a deviant form of government. But curiously enough, he regards it as the least bad form of government, which was the question I posted for class this week. What does he mean by that, basically? So even though he talks about 6 different types of regimes, he mostly talks about just 3 for the most part. And what we'll see is that the term polity is in many ways kind of a combination, or a synthesis, if you will, of oligarchy and democracy. So in a large sense, it sort of derives from, or sort of like almost like a hybrid of these 2 types of governments. Oligarchy basically being ruled by the wealthy, democracy basically being ruled by the poor, neither which he regards really as a desirable thing in its own right. Now, again, Aristotle stresses an economic interpretation of oligarchy and democracy, like I just said. Plato talks about it as well, but Aristotle even places more emphasis on it. Another important thing is that Aristotle sort of changes the order of the deviant types of governments. For Plato, democracy was almost the worst type of government that you could have. The only thing worse than that was a tyranny, basically. Aristotle kind of inverts that relationship a little bit. Oligarchy for him is basically worse than democracy. So while he would like to see a more balanced form of government, when push comes to shove, he's a little more comfortable with even a so-called bad type of government that at least rules in the interest of the majority, than a bad type of government that only rules in the interest of the wealthy minority, basically. And I think Aristotle's interpretation of these things in the economic, really laying stress on the economic notions of oligarchy and democracy is important. And I think in many ways seems to suggest, much like Marx would many centuries later, that there's a kind of class conflict that basically plays out throughout most societies, and that a good part of political conflict will basically revolve around the idea of what Marx would term class struggle. That in many ways, the terms oligarchy and democracy could almost be like analogs or counterparts to Marx's ideas of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, in fact. Now, again, when he talks about a polity, or often referred to as a mixed government, he means for a more sort of, again, moderate type of government, a government which is more, aiming towards the mean, again, if we go back to his ethical theories, if we understand democracy and oligarchy as two extremes, then a polity is sort of more in the mean, the more sort of, moderate type of regime. He places a strong emphasis on the importance of a middle class. He doesn't want to see, a vast, sort of polarization of wealth as well. I feel like there's something else I want to say, but I'm blanking on that right now. Yeah, Jerome.
So, in your opinion, what would Marx say about the centrality of, shall we say, well, so Aristotle always tried to strike a balance. In a sense, it's it might be an anachronistic term, it is kind of centrist. So we're trying to find a balance. What would Marx say about that? Sort of reformism, if we could call that, instead of trying to achieve revolution.
Marx would say that it does not work. Marx would say that you can't reform, these economic conflicts, these class conflicts, that any attempt to do so will either be ineffective or will eventually sort of, wear itself out or kind of break down. And there might be something to be said for that, as I'll say as I go on. But yeah, I mean, Marx would not. I'm not saying that Aristotle's, ideas are like Marx's. I think Marx is much more of a revolutionary thinker. Aristotle's ideas, I think, seem much more, again, relevant in sort of, what I guess you would call the mainstream of political thinking, in that he places a strong emphasis on the middle class, as American politics does. We're always talking about, like the middle class in this country, not the working class, but we talk about the middle class a lot. His idea of a polity, even though it is distinct from democracy here, is in many ways, I think, very much similar to what we would consider in modern day terms a democratic government, or a constitutional democracy, or a republican democracy, or a liberal democracy. In other words, a democratic government, as again it says here, defined by many rulers. So there is a democratic element to polity, but you have, checks and balances. To use another modern day term, you have a separation of powers. You have some oligarchic elements too, which again you can see quite clearly within the American Constitution. The Senate and the House of Representatives, for example, you can see various, elements of the democratic and oligarchic institutions within American life. I'm not saying that the House is, by the way, authentically democratic branch of government, but at least in theory, it's supposed to be. Gerrymandering and things like that tend to undermine that. But in theory, it is supposed to be, the more democratic branch of government. So yeah, I think, Aristotle's idea of a polity would come, very similar to what we would today define as a democratic government, or a liberal democratic government, or a constitutional government, and things like that, where you have democratic elements, but they're sort of restrained by countervailing forces. You have, like I said, democratic and oligarchic elements within it, and possibly others as well. Some would argue that the president kind of takes the role of a monarchy, that if the House is the democratic branch of government, the Senate is the oligarchic branch of government, then the president is like a monarch. So you even have that kind of combination of things as well. So yes, I would say that Aristotle's ideas are very relevant, but keeping that in mind, now I've already shown this graph, I think last class, but I'll show it again. I think this is a slightly different version of it. Given that Aristotle is concerned with the economic polarization of wealth, given that he's concerned that you sort of need a middle class to sort of preserve political stability and things like that. What does that say in our current day political climate, where we've seen such a concentration of wealth over the last several decades, in fact? And I think I already explained this last class, so I won't go through it again. But basically, again, the higher this line goes, the more concentrated wealth is among the top 10% of income earners. And this one goes up to 2012. I think the last one only went up to 2010. As you can see, by 2012, we've actually shattered the previous peak of inequality just before the Great Depression in 1929. Now this only goes up to 2012, but I can assure you that not much has changed since then. If anything, COVID has made things even worse in terms of more and more wealth being accumulated at the top. By the way, this is showing income. So this is not a full, if anything, it underplays the concentration of wealth, because income does not include things like stocks and bonds and things like that. It simply includes income, salaries and wages and things like that. So when you account for those things, when you account for overall wealth, real estate and stocks and bonds and things like that, it's even more sort of slanted towards the top, even more unbalanced at the top. And you don't have to be a Marxist to be concerned over things like this. Aristotle, if he were to see this, the point I'm driving at here is, if Aristotle were to see this, he would be very concerned about the stability of American political life, where we are now. That the sort of massive concentration of wealth in the hands of the wealthy is incompatible, really, with democratic political forms of any kind, whether a polity, call it a polity or whatever. That the idea that the political power being held in the ideas in the hands of many people is not compatible at all with this massive amount of wealth concentration. And like I said, if anything, this sort of underplays the concentration of wealth. Now, many people would argue, for example, the economists Piketty and Sayers would argue that this is why you had such a massive crash in 2008. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. They are not Marxist economists. The Marxist answer to that would be, a fall in investment, basically, coming from a fall in the profit rate in a capitalist economy. I'm not trying to explain the crisis of 2008. But I do think that at the very least, this level of inequality, like I already said, is completely incompatible with democracy. In fact, that the United States is basically an oligarchy in the terms that Aristotle has set down for it. That if you think about all political power is basically concentrated in the hands of the very wealthy as well. They control the elections. They through the donor class and things like that, almost all the laws and judicial actions of the state basically, benefit the top 1% and 10%. That, in all meaningful ways that the United States has basically become an oligarchy, probably since the 1980s. I mean, if you look at the growth in inequality since then. So you could, I guess, thank Ronald Reagan for that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about that. Well, so other people, of course, besides Aristotle, would share that view. For example, James Madison, one of the founders, in the Federalist Papers. So when he talks about the importance of factions and how factions sort of rip apart a society, and that the point of the Constitution was basically to prevent, factions from getting that far out of control. Listen here what he has to say about it, which I think is interesting. He says, but the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes. So he even uses the term class, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. So I think Madison here, much like the other, founders, is using a very kind of Aristotelian argument to talk about politics. Now, the difference again between Madison and Aristotle from Marx is that they're not revolutionary thinkers, right? Their idea is that, you know, a well-crafted political society can contain these class conflicts and sort of regulate them, as he says, regulate these various interests and sort of prevent them from sort of getting too far out of control, basically, and creating great social instability as a result of that. Marx, of course, would say that you can't do that. That you know, so long as you're dealing with a capitalist economic system, which is already coming into being at the time that Madison is writing, maybe not so much Aristotle, that the contradictions in the way in which this economy works will make that an impossible thing. You cannot control these conflicts for long. Any attempts at reforming the system basically will either fail or will, you know, even if they're successful in the short term, will ultimately break down in the long term. And given, you know, the statistics on inequality within the United States, I wonder if there's something to what Marx is saying here. I mean, certainly you could look at it in terms of this, you know, if it is possible to contain these conflicts within, you know, politics as it's now conceived of, what are they waiting for? I mean, you know, when are they going to do something about this? Piketty and Sayers first came out with this data, I think in 2003. Nobody paid attention to it back then because, you know, the war on terror was in full swing back then. But then they came out sort of a revised series, I think probably around this time, somewhere around maybe 2012 or maybe even 2008 or something like that. And maybe I've done subsequent revisions since then. The data has been around for 20 years. It's been an issue of public concern for at least 10 or 15 years that this has actually been sort of a high profile issue. If they can do anything about it, you know, what are they waiting for? Because I think this is probably the most important political conflict of the day, at least within, you know, American society. And again, even if it's not a cause of the economic crash, like I say, it's very much something that is incompatible with democratic government. And I think you already see the results of that, the growth of fascism, Donald Trump, and things like that, and just the complete sort of, you know, paralysis of the political system from basically being able to do anything to deal with these issues, and the lowering living standards of many people within this country, the, you know, declining life expectancy and various other, you know, issues that come of that as well. So again, you don't have to be a Marxist to be concerned with this. Both, I'm sure if Madison and Aristotle were around today, they would be extremely concerned by the massive growth of inequality within society. The key issue, though, is what do you do about it? Can you actually sort of control these things within the context of American politics, or do you need basically what Marx would argue a revolution to be able to really, you know, deal with the root issues of this? It's a very compelling question, and you know, I'm more inclined to a certain point of view maybe, but I'm, you know, it's certainly, you know, an interesting thing to discuss from different points of view as well. So then we really go into, again, a discussion of Aristotle's idea of justice, which he says basically has two main forms. And again, this also sort of, you know, picks up from some things that he talks about in his ethics. But justice has sort of both a universal and particular aspect to it. Aristotle also talks about the so-called good man and the good citizen. And I think when he talks about the good man, he's meaning about justice in sort of a universal sense. Justice, which is always good, always just in any circumstance being, which he says, again, is being a lawful person, you know, acting towards the common advantage of all. But Aristotle also says that there are sort of, you know, particular ideas of justice, which sounds almost like he's making a kind of relativistic argument. The justice is different depending upon the society that you're living in. If you're living in an oligarchic society, you're going to have a different concept of justice from living in a democratic society. In an oligarchy, justice will be, things that, are conducive to making wealth, or like things like, paying off your debts, and, being fiscally responsible and things like that. Whereas in a democratic society, justice will be more about equality and things like that. So it sounds like he's making a kind of relativistic argument, but he also says, no, there is also sort of justice in a more universal sense, that there's sort of a transcendent idea of justice where, goodness is sort of good in any circumstance, basically. A modern day rainbow coalition will be brewing for the next few years. Well, maybe, again, I would also say, like, well, what is taking so long? I mean, these are not new issues. I mean, inequality has been getting worse since the 1980s. It's become a very high profile issue over the last 10 or 15 years. I haven't seen a lot really done, though, to try to address it. I mean, you could argue that sort of led to a revival of socialism within the United States. The fact that you have, people in Congress who call themselves socialists is probably a response to that. But then that leads to a whole other series of questions about, how effective are they really? Are they really pursuing a socialist politics, or are they just sort of giving a kind of cover for the Democratic Party? I mean, personally, I'd be more inclined to that, latter point of view, treat them with a level of skepticism, basically. But it's certainly leading to something. I mean, things are definitely happening in a response to the worsening, again, the now decades-long trend of worsening inequality within society. All right, so what is the common advantage, though? There's no real easy way to resolve that. Then Aristotle talks about the idea of distributive justice, which, again, I would say that almost any discussion of justice necessarily leads to this. So how do you, again, sort of dole out the resources of society in a fair way? And I've already kind of talked about this, so I won't go through the whole thing again. Suffice to say that, there's no real agreement on how you should actually do that. Again, an oligarchic and democratic society would have different conceptions, basically, of what's a fair way to dole out resources. That everyone agrees that you should treat equal persons equally and unequal persons unequally. But again, there's no clear way to how you actually, realize that concept. Aristotle argues that benefits should be distributed according to merit, which, although he doesn't use the term, sounds very much like this modern day term we like to call meritocracy. And what does that mean, basically? That people that, well, as it says here, if A contributes twice as much as B, according to some metric of merit, in other words, some way of measuring merit, then A's return also ought to be twice B's. So if A contributes twice as much, then A should get twice as much as B. And this obviously refers to things like wealth. So this is used as a way to justify wealth inequality. The people that have more wealth deserve it because they contribute more to people that don't. Now, there are statistics that I think would contradict that. If you look at, the productivity of the economy versus the, sort of stagnant wage growth since the 1970s, that I think would undermine that idea. The economy has continued to, increase its productivity, but the returns of that basically going to labor has been stagnant, basically. Whereas, since the 1970s, whereas from the late 1940s through the early 1970s, you saw both productivity and wages basically going up almost at the same rate. Now, when we talk about meritocracy, we're usually talking about things like education and training and things like that. So the idea behind this notion of meritocracy is that people who are more educated should have more of a say in things than people who are less educated. Now, is that an idea that people would agree with? I don't know. It presumes, of course, also that the people that are actually in charge are more educated or more talented or smarter, basically, than the people who are not in charge. And I think there is good reason to sort of push back against that idea. I think there, suffice to say, I mean, it's a hard thing to maybe to prove, but I don't necessarily think that the people that are in charge, whether it's in terms of politics or even the people that run corporations and things like that, the people that create culture that's shared by people, within society. I'm not really convinced that the people that are in charge of those things are necessarily the smartest people. I think there's good reason to think that they are not, in fact. Then, in fact, I think you can make a pretty good argument, again, it'd be hard exactly to prove it maybe, but you might be able to, that there's been an overall sort of cultural and intellectual decline within American society. Not just that, the level of the average person, but among the elites as well, that the elites, the sort of ruling class of today has intellectually declined, basically, even from, the standards of previous ruling classes of previous eras. Certainly, if you compare people to the founders, I think you can make a pretty good argument. But even people that were running things 50 to 100 years ago may have actually been a little more on the ball than today's ruling class, who seem very incompetent in many ways. Maybe they're just, not up to dealing with the challenges of modern day life. In fact, I would argue that this, idiotic story of the Chinese weather balloon is probably an example of that. I mean, they clearly think that the American people are dumb, but maybe they themselves are dumb themselves if they actually, think that this is a good, way to sort of, drum up anti-Chinese, sentiment or something like that. And being that meritocracy is often tied to education, it really calls into question our education system and how that works, something which I think might be of interest to college students. If you read articles, for example, about, like for example, there's one article I used to use in some of my classes, even from, I think it was Forbes magazine, like this, top 10 secrets to success in college or something like that. And I've read it elsewhere as well. If you read these things, closely, I mean, they pretty much all but admit that social networking is at least as important as the actual education that you get. And by saying at least as important, they're kind of implying that it may in fact be more important, that social networking that you get from college is actually more important than your actual education. Well, is that the basis of merit? I mean, should people who are better at social networking necessarily be in charge of all the key positions within society? I'm not necessarily sure that is the case. It certainly doesn't say much for the, the intellectual level of people. Not that I'm saying the people that are good at social networking are not intelligent people, but to make that the more important criterion, I think that reveals a very big problem within our education system. It's almost like saying that there's like sort of like a bias against more introverted people over more extroverted people. That extroverted people should be in charge of everything and introverted people aren't. Certainly, there are probably more introverted people out there that have intellectual, aptitudes and skills and things like that. So to what extent are those people sort of being excluded from having, sort of a say in things that go on? And that even, again, reflects other things about our education system, that, to go to certain schools or to succeed in schools, you have to join 1 million extracurricular activities and things like that. I mean, is that necessarily the most important thing? I mean, and these things are fairly recent as well. I mean, I was listening to an interview with an artist, a guy named Dan Clowes, who went to Pratt, which is, a good art school in Brooklyn, I think. And he, said it was kind of like a waste of time, by the way. But this is like in the late 1970s. He was saying that, up until then, like, if you had just good grades, you could basically go to like Harvard or something like that. That you didn't have this sort of, extra emphasis on again, doing 1 million different extra curricular stuff. Now that has become much more sort of the focus of education in the United States. And you have to judge something by the results. And you have to look, well, what are the people that kind of, you know, succeed and thrive under that system? Are we actually really getting the so-called best and brightest in the top positions within society? I'm not so sure. I even listened to an interview with the actress Kate Beckinsale, who I know nothing about, but it was actually kind of an interesting thing. She's English, and she went to, I think, like Oxford or Cambridge or one of those schools and studied literature. And apparently in the United Kingdom, you know, you can be just really good at just one subject, basically. And if you're, you know, demonstrate some kind of excellence in that, that's good enough that you can get into, you know, again, a really top school. Whereas in the American education system, and this is a point that she was making herself, and I was, you know, impressed with, you know, how she spoke about this. The American education system tends to, you know, emphasize this idea of being the so-called well-rounded student, right? They want people who are good at everything. But is that actually what you're going to get? Or are you going to get people that, instead of being like excellent at everything, you're going to get people that are pretty good at most things? You're going to get kind of like an average. You're going to get sort of a mediocrity of people who are maybe proficient to a certain extent, or, you know, good but not great, as you might say. And I think, you know, you have to then, you know, wonder what impact is that having on society as a whole, when essentially that is what is producing, you know, the ruling elites, basically, which, you know, run things. Yeah, Jerome.
Well, I do agree with most of what you just said. If I could just perhaps advocate for the devil, but bring a different cultural perspective. Well, in my country, France, so the system works a bit differently. When you graduate from high school, when you go to college, it's more specialized, right? Especially when you go to public university, as I do. I'm a law student. So pretty much what I do is quite what an American student would do at the beginning of law school, and I've been doing that for a few times. But that would be the same thing for political science, sociology. You would be more specialized. And that's a good thing, I think, by many aspects, because you really go deep into the subject, and you really, instead of just like touching the surface, the upper layer, you really go deep into it, and you have the ability to like take discern from it. On the other hand, people like me who goes to public university with that kind of philosophy of teaching, usually there's a lack of training on how to find internships, on how to acquire what they call soft skills. Basically, you're a bit of a nerd in a sense. So one of the things I find interesting here is that college encourages you to have professional experiences, to have associative experiences. And I think that's also a very good way of, you know, testing different things and see what you like in life. And yeah, I might sound a bit Aristotelian, but yeah, I definitely think that between the two systems, there's probably something that can be found.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that people should be exposed to different ideas, and you know, it is good to an extent, obviously, to have people, you know, experience different fields of knowledge, because, you know, sometimes you might find something that you like that you didn't even know that you liked. But I think, at least in the American education system, and I would assume then that this is probably in many ways more distinctive of the American system. Not to say that the United Kingdom, you know, I mean, if you look at it in terms of, you know, politics, I mean, France and the United Kingdom certainly have their share of problems too, but are they as bad as problems within the United States? You could certainly make an argument for that maybe they're not, at least in some regards, or at least not as intense, maybe. But in the US, it becomes so much more of a sort of like a gatekeeping function, whereas you are not allowed to sort of progress, or you're sort of denied, you know, essentially, even the opportunity to have an education at certain institutions, unless you sort of demonstrate this idea of well-roundedness, which I think is a very kind of flawed idea. I think it's in theory, it sounds great that you want people that are, you know, great at everything. But I don't think most of the time you're really going to get that. You're going to get people that are kind of okay at everything. And that includes different, you know, subjects, you know, math and science and history and literature and so on and so forth. But again, as well as the, you know, the emphasis that we have to playing, you know, sports and different extracurricular stuff. I don't know if people's ability to get an education, you know, should really hinge as much on those things, particularly at the elite level, particularly as, you know, sort of a requirement for like entry into the, you know, the political elite, or be basically being able to play sort of a you know, a role within, you know, the running of society, whether it's, like I said, politics, corporations, you know, many of them were very incompetent in many ways, you know, not able to see supply chain issues, you know, related to, you know, COVID coming, I think is a good example of that. I mean, we talk about the sort of the cultural, the decline of the United States, you know, even things like, you know, like the crappy movies and the kind of, you know, deficient state of popular culture. And I realize that this probably sounds very subjective to a large extent. I don't know, you know, like I said, I don't know how you can prove these things. They do at least seem to be opinions that are widely shared. I don't think I'm the only person that feels this way. There does seem to be a sort of growing sentiment such as that exists. And, you know, I mean, this is just a college class. So we certainly have, you know, the freedom to speculate on these things and talk about that. And from what I'm seeing, you know, in the comments and, you know, feedback I'm getting, it seems that other people emphasize agree with that as well. Yeah, the emphasis on STEM classes and things like that. I mean, look, if you're good at that, fine. But I mean, if you're not, but you're really good, you know, at history, or you have a very good aptitude in literature and things like that, you know, again, I mean, according to what this actor said, I mean, you could still go to like a top level school in the United Kingdom and just study history, or read literature, or study math. That seems to make, you know, to me at least, seems to make a lot more sense. And, you know, again, when you look at the, you know, you sort of survey the current state of American life, I mean, I think there's good reason to question whether or not, you know, the so-called best and brightest are actually really making it to sort of, you know, the top positions within society. Anyway, went on a bit of a tangent there, but I think it's an interesting topic. So how you distribute the resources of society. Again, we place a very large emphasis on education, something I'm sure Aristotle would agree with as well. But I mean, maybe their idea of education would probably be a little bit different than ours. Probably place much more of an emphasis, again, on philosophy and things like that, and things we tend to neglect here. And I mean, and that's another thing. I'll make one more comment on that. I mean, to the extent, yes, we do. I mean, American education budgets are terrible. I mean, you know, been decreasing budgets, you know, at least, you know, relative to other things for years now. To the extent that education is funded, most of the money basically goes towards STEM, or really, actually, a lot of it goes towards athletics. I mean, I'm speaking here at Rutgers. I mean, the highest paid official at Rutgers, and really the highest paid, I think, public official in the state of New Jersey is the head football coach, you know, for Rutgers. I mean, it is kind of strange to think that, you know, that person is paid so much more money than anything else. And even before class, I just happened to be glancing at something that mentioned the amount of money. Apparently the Rutgers football program like lost like $50 million last year or something like that. And people were, you know, complaining because, you know, when it comes to funding everything else, you know, you're always being told, you know, there's not enough money in the budget and things like that. But when it comes to sports, they just are like throwing money at it, and there's like almost like no accountability basically for where the money is going, which I think is a big issue. Not that I'm against, you know, sports or anything like that. I'm not, of course, but prioritizing things maybe, you know, should be something that people do a little bit more. And again, I mean, maybe, you know, it is important for people to learn about the humanities and the arts and things like that. Maybe those things are as important as STEM. Certainly our society does not, you know, confer as much value upon those things, but I think that there's certainly a good argument to be made for why those things should be emphasized more. I think the reason why most of the public is so apathetic towards politics, and frankly kind of ignorant about a lot of political issues, is a consequence of that as well. Anyway, another tangent, but so Aristotle also argues for, I can see it's already a little after 2, so I'll try to wrap things up. That justice doesn't just regulate how you distribute things, but it also, serves as a standard to correct previous injustices, or what he calls rectification. So if C defrauds D by amount X, then justice requires depriving C of X and restoring X to D as a matter of re-establishing a kind of equality between them. So there's 2 sort of aspects to that. Anyway, so Aristotle says the highest concept of justice is an aristocratic notion of justice, a life not pursued to making money, as in an oligarchy, or even just promoting equality, he says, as in a democracy, but promoting noble actions, which he identifies with aristocracy. He also places a good emphasis on friendship as well. The justice is important, but you should not neglect friendship either. Anyway, the idea of rectification, I could obviously go into another tangent about that, talking about student loan debt, or something like that, to what extent people have been cheated basically into being loaded up with these the crazy amounts of debt, and to what extent do you really owe anything to the people that are profiting off your debt. But I'll leave that one aside for now. Anyway, so again, and part of the theme of this class is the influence of these thinkers upon the American founders as well. So I quoted Madison a while ago. How about a quote from the Declaration of Independence, which again does refer to a notion of justice. That justice is an important concept within American political life as well. So again, the famous opening phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." So again, a lot of references there to key Aristotelian concepts: happiness, justice, the consent of the governed, which again, Aristotle has some interesting views on democracy. All right, so I'll run through these last few pretty quickly. I realize I've been talking for a while, though I appreciate the contributions from other people in class as well. What is the best constitution? So Aristotle deals with this in a bunch of different ways. He says, in a sort of utopian view, what is the best type of government that you could ever imagine, which he talks about towards the end of the Politics, book 7 and 8. What are the best under the circumstances? So given that the best one you could ever imagine is probably unrealistic, what's sort of like the second best one? What's one that's a little more realistic, at least? That one is a polity, the best under the circumstances. But interestingly enough, and here again, here's Aristotle being somewhat of a scientist and even somewhat of a physician. He also argues, even if you're living in one of the deviant types of government, what is the, how can you try to make that government, messed up as it is, sort of work the best possible way under the circumstances? So it's interesting that he deals with that idea as well. So anyway, the sort of utopian idea that Aristotle has, he criticizes Plato. Plato's, of course, ideal society is one where only a small group of people actually rule. Aristotle criticizes Plato for neglecting the happiness of people. Aristotle, of course, if you were going to simply imagine or speculate what would be the best type of government overall, of course, you'd say, of course, it would be one where all people have property, have political power, that they are virtuous people. There should be education for all people. If you're just going to freely speculate about what's the best type of government you could possibly imagine, of course that would be it. And he criticizes, Plato for having such a negative view, even though it's purely, Plato's idea of an ideal society as well. Again, the second best is the polity, which I've already talked about. Strong emphasis on the middle class. Now, I think this is the last slide. Yes. So again, one of the more interesting aspects of Aristotle's theory is he says that democracy is the least bad form of government. It's a bad government, but it's also not as bad as some of the other bad types of government, basically. Now, many people sort of give emphasis to the notion that Aristotle seems to even suggest at places that the majority of people as a whole, although they may be lacking in individual virtue, may actually turn out to be better than the virtuous few, even though on an individual level they may be considered inferior. And he seems to argue that, again, sort of like the collective resources or the collective wisdom as people as a whole may in fact make up for, may in fact compensate for their individual weaknesses, so to speak. And there is an argument for democracy there. There's even an argument against the idea of meritocracy, the idea that even if you had highly educated people who are not just good at social networking, but like let's say they actually are supremely intelligent people, even then, sort of again the sort of collective wisdom or collective resources of people as a whole may even in fact be better overall. He at least seems to suggest that. Of course, that assumes that there's sort of very sort of open forum of communication. People are allowed to express opinions and sort of debate ideas and sort of work out what's the best possible idea. All right, I think basically the rest of that I already kind of covered. So I think that pretty much gives you a good overview of Aristotle. I mean, there's certainly a lot of interesting ideas here. I guess that's all I really have to say about that. So does anyone have any questions for me? I know a couple of people want to talk to me after class, so just stay on the Zoom. Yeah, Jerome.
So there is something I'm not sure about, which is the term politeia, polity. So while reading the book, I don't know, well, while reading the book in the light of what we have already said about Plato, I don't really understand to what extent politeia should be translated as polity, mixed constitution, or republic. So what would be your thoughts about it?
I mean, it can be, I guess you could say it could be interpreted to cover all of those things. I mean, it basically refers to the political community. Depending upon, I guess you would say the good political community, right? As opposed to sort of one of the so-called deviant forms. Although again, Aristotle uses the term as well to talk about the Constitution, which includes the bad constitutions as well. So basically, the politeia is basically, Aristotle would say it's the Constitution. It's basically, I guess you would say, the political structure, the way in which the political institutions of the society are set up, whether it's not, it allows for one ruler, a few rulers, multiple rulers, whether or not the rulers are set up in a way to govern in the common advantage or in their own interest, as he says, the difference between the correct and the deviant forms of government. Especially if I make another reference to it, I think I do earlier on. Politikos. Yeah, so the politeia, at least the way in which Aristotle uses it, is basically refers to the Constitution, basically the sort of political structure of the city-state, of the polis. But it's probably used in different contexts as well. Okay, any other questions about anything? Okay, so that's it. And we'll pick up next week.